Continuing Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. He do just as he's a minute terror. He select out anybody that suit him and put another one in his place, and make the first one happy forever and leave the other one to burn with Satan. Now, if someone's being redeemed, they're being redeemed. It's not that their place is being taken by another, but, well, these thoughts are coming through a Christian, so the idea that what happens on a smaller scale, right? The preacher said it was just like they done in England one time, long time ago. The queen, she left her baby laying around one day and went out a-callin', and one o' the negroes around about the place that was most wide. She come in and see the chilla layin' around, and tuck and put her own child's clothes on the queen's chilla, and put the queen's chilla clothes on her own chilla, and then left her own chilla laying around and tuck and toted the queen's chilla home to the negro quarter, and nobody ever found it out, and her child was the king Bombay, and sold the queen's child down the river one time when they had to sell up the estate. Done now, the preacher said it his own self, and it ain't no sin, 'cause white folks done it. They done it, yes, they done it. And not only just common white folks, neither, but the biggest quality day is in the whole billin'. Oh, I'm so glad I remember about that. Now, even the racism against whites is just not something acceptable. And we found after the slave days that racism against whites was actually the more common one. But the impact was greater until till the end of the 60s, really. But having the characters that are foreign or black talk this way just it doesn't help. It doesn't make the story easy. I guess back in the day that was the sensibility. But yeah. She got up, right-hearted and happy, and went to the cradles and spent what was left of the night practicing. She would give her own child a light pat and say humbly, "Lay still, Marse Tom." Then give the real Tom a pat and say with severity, "Lay still, Chambers. Does you want me to take something to you?" As she progressed with her practice, she was surprised to see how steadily and surely the awe which had kept her tongue reverent and her manner humble towards her young master was transferring itself to her speech and manner toward the usurper, and how, similarly handy, she was becoming and transferring her mother's curtness of speech and peremptoriness of manner to the unlucky heir of the ancient house of Driscoll. She took occasional rests from practicing and absorbed herself in calculating her chances. They'll sell these negroes today for stealing the money, then they'll buy some mo' that don't know ye chillun, so that's all right. When I takes the chillun out to get the air, the minute I's round the corner, I's gwine to gum the mouse all round with jam, then they can't nobody notice they's changed. Yes, I gwinter do that till I's safe, if it's a year. They ain't but one man that's I's afeard of, and that's that Pudd'nhead Wilson. They calls him a Pudd'nhead and says he's a fool. My land, that man ain't no mo' fool than I is. He's the smartest man in this town. Lesson it's Judge Driscoll or maybe Pem Howard. Blame that man, he worries me with dem ornery glasses of his'n. I believe he's a witch, but Naman I's gwine to happen round the one o' these days and let on that I reckon he wants to print the chillen's fingers again. And if he don't notice there's change, I bound days ain't nobody gwine to notice, and then I's safe, sure. But I reckon I'll take along a horseshoe to keep off the witch work. The new negroes gave Roxy no trouble, of course. The master gave her none, for one of his speculations was in jeopardy, and his mind was so occupied that he hardly saw the children when he looked at them, and all Roxy had to do was to get them both into a gale of laughter when he came about, and their faces were mainly cavities exposing gums, and he was gone again before the spasm passed and the little creatures resumed a human aspect. Within a few days, the fate of the speculation became so dubious that Mr. Percy went away with his brother the judge to see what could be done with it. It was a land speculation as usual, and had gotten complicated with a lawsuit. The men were gone 7 weeks. Before they got back, Roxy had paid her visit to Wilson and was satisfied. Wilson took the fingerprints, labeled them with the names and date, October the 1st, and put them carefully away and continued his chat with Roxy, who seemed very anxious that he should admire the great advance in flesh and beauty which the babies had made since he took their fingerprints a month before. He complimented their improvement to her contentment, and as they were without any disguise of jam or other strain, she trembled all the while and was miserably frightened lest at any moment but he didn't. He discovered nothing, and she went home jubilant and dropped all concern about the matter permanently out of her mind. Chapter 4. The Ways of Changelings. Adam and Eve had many advantages, but the principal one was that they escaped teething. Pudd'nhead, Wilson's calendar. There is the trouble about special providences, namely, that there is so often a doubt as to which party was intended to be the beneficiary. In the case of the children, the bears, and the prophet, the bears got more real satisfaction out of the episode than the prophet did, because they got the children. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. Well, Will Smith could tell you, don't make bow jokes, but this story must henceforth accommodate itself to the change which Roxana has consummated, and call the real heir Chambers, and the usurping little slave Thomas A. Becket, shortening this latter name to Tom for daily use, as the people about him did. Tom was a bad baby. From the beginning of his usurpation, he would cry for nothing, but would burst into storms of devilish temper with no notice, and let scream after scream and squall after squall, then climax the thing with holding his breath, that frightful speciality of his teething nursling, in the throes of which the creature exhausts its lungs and then is convulsed with noiseless squirmings and twistings and kickings in the effort to get its breath, while the lips turn blue and the mouth stands wide and rigid, offering for inspection one wee tooth set in the lower rim of a hoop of red gums, and when appalling stillness has endured until one is sure the lost breath will never return, a nurse comes flying and dashes water in the child's face, and presto, the lungs fill and instantly discharge a shriek or a yell or a howl which bursts the listening ear and surprises the owner of it into saying words which would not go well with a halo if he had one. Of course, the aura, the light, heat, moisture, and magnetism is really what they talk about with the halo. But the baby Tom would claw anybody who came within reach of his nails and pound anybody he could reach with his rattle. He would scream for water until he got it, and then throw a cup and all on the floor and scream for more. He was indulged in all his caprices, however troublesome and exasperating they might be. He was allowed to eat anything he wanted, particularly things that would give him the stomach ache. When he got to be old enough to begin to toddle about and say broken words and get an idea of what his hands were for, he was a more consummate pest than ever. Roxy got no rest while he was awake. He would call for anything and everything he saw, simply saying, "Want it, want it." It was a command, and when it was brought, he said in a frenzy and motioning it away with his hands, "Don't aunt it, don't aunt it." And the moment it was gone, he set up frantic yells of "Aunt it, aunt it, aunt it." And Roxy had to give wings to her heels to get that thing back to him again before he could get time to carry out his intention of going into convulsions about it. What he preferred above all other things was the tongs. This was because his father had forbidden him to have them, lest he break windows and furniture with them. The moment Roxy's back was turned, he would toddle to the presence of the tongs and say, "Like it," and cock his eye to one side and see if Roxy was observing, and then "Aunt it," and cock his eye again, then "Have it." Another furtive glance, and finally take it, and the prize was his. And the next moment, the heavy implement was raised aloof. The next, there was a crash and a squall, and the cat was off on 3 legs to meet an engagement. Roxy would arrive just as the lamp or window went to irredeemable smash. Tom got all the petting, Chambers got none. Tom got all the delicacies, Chambers got mush and milk, and clabber without sugar. In consequence, Tom was a sickly child, and Chambers wasn't. Tom was fractious, as Roxy called it, and overbearing. Chambers was meek and docile. With all her splendid common sense and practical everyday ability, Roxy was a doting fool of a mother. She was toward her child, and she was also more than this. By the fiction created by herself, she was becoming her master. The necessity of recognizing this relation outwardly and of perfecting herself in all the forms required to express the recognition had moved her to such diligence and faithfulness in practicing these forms that this exercise soon concreted itself into habit. It became automatic and unconscious, and a natural result followed. Deceptions intended solely for others gradually grew well, practically into self-deceptions as well. The mock reverence became real reverence. The mock obsequiousness, real obsequiousness. The mock homage, real homage. The little counterfeit rift of separation between imitation slave and imitation master widened and widened, and became an abyss, and a very real one. And on one side of it stood Roxy, the dupe of her own deceptions. On the other stood her child, no longer a usurper to her, but her accepted and recognized master. He was her darling, her master, and her deity all in one, and in her worship of him she forgot who she was and what he had been. In babyhood, Tom cuffed and banged and scratched Chambers unrebuked, and Chambers early learned that between meekly bearing it and resenting it, the advantage all lay with the former policy. The few times that his persecutions had moved him beyond control and made him fight back had cost him very dearly at headquarters. Not at the hands of Roxy, for if she ever went beyond scolding him sharply for forgetting who his young master was, she at least never extended her punishment beyond a box on the ear. No, Percy Driscoll was the person. He told Chambers that under no provocation whatever was he privileged to lift his hand against his little master, which is absolutely not right. You can't mistreat slaves. Well, I mean, it's not right to mistreat slaves anyways. Chambers overstepped the line 3 times and got 3 such convincing cannings from the man who was his father and didn't know it, that he took Tom's cruelties in all humility after that and made no more experiments. Outside of the house, the 2 boys were together all throughout their boyhood. Chambers was strong beyond his years and a good fighter. Strong because he was coarsely fed and hard worked about the house, and a good fighter because Tom furnished him plenty of practice on white boys whom he hated and was afraid of. Chambers was his constant bodyguard to and from school. He was present on the playground at recess to protect his charge. He fought himself into such a formidable reputation by and by that Tom could have changed clothes with him and ridden in peace, like Sir Kay in Launcelot's armor. He was good at games of skill, too. Tom staked him with marbles to play keeps with, and then took all winnings away from him. In the winter season, Chambers was on hand, in Tom's worn-out clothes, with holey red mittens and holey shoes and pants holey at the knees and seat, to drag a sled up the hill for Tom, warmly clad, to ride down on, but he never got a ride himself. He built snowmen and snow fortifications under Tom's directions. He was Tom's patient target when Tom wanted to do some snowballing, but the target couldn't fire back. Chambers carried Tom's skates to the river and strapped them on him, then trotted around after him on the ice, so as to be on hand when wanted, but he wasn't ever asked to try the skates himself. In summer, the pet pastime of the boys of Dawson's Landing. Isn't that the name of a show, too? I don't know, I didn't watch a lot of that stuff. Was to steal apples, peaches, and melons from the farmers' fruit wagons, mainly on account of the risk they ran of getting their heads laid open with the butt of the farmer's whip. Tom was a distinguished adept at these thefts by proxy. Chambers did his stealing and got the peach stones, apple cores, and melon rinds for his share. So, stuff for gardening versus the fruit of the garden. But having to eat the food that other people, the base of what people have been eating off of for the scraps on it, it's horrible to put people through. Tom always made Chambers go in swimming with him and stay behind him as a protection. When Tom had had enough, he would slip out and tie knots in Chambers' shirt, dip the knots in the water to make them hard to undo, then dress himself and sit by and laugh, while the naked shiverer tugged at the stubborn knots with his teeth. Tom did his humble comrade these various ill turns, partly out of a native viciousness, and partly because he hated him for his superiorities of physique and pluck, and for his manifold cleverness. Tom couldn't dive, for it gave him splitting headaches. Chambers could dive without inconvenience, and was fond of doing it. He excited so much admiration one day among a crowd of white boys by throwing back somersaults from the stern of a canoe that it wearied Tom's spirit. And at last he shoved the canoe underneath Chambers while he was in the air, so that he came down on his head on the canoe bottom, and while he lay unconscious, several of Tom's ancient adversaries saw that their long-desired opportunity was come, and they gave the false heir such drubbing that with Chambers' best help, he was hardly able to drag himself home afterwards. When the boys were 15 and upward, Tom was showing off in the river one day, and he was taken with a cramp, and shouted for help. It was a common trick with the boys, particularly if a stranger was present, to pretend a cramp and howl for help. Then when the stranger came tearing hand over hand to the rescue, the howler would go on struggling and howling till he was close at hand, and then replace the howl with a sarcastic smile and swim blandly away, while the boys assailed the dupe with a volley of jeers and laughter. Well, that would prevent real people from being helped. And again, I would say be honest, even in jokes. Tom never tried this joke as yet, but was supposed to be trying it now, but the boys held warily back, but Chambers believed his master was in earnest. Therefore he swam out and arrived in time, unfortunately, and saved his life. This was the last feather. Tom had managed to endure everything else, but to have remained publicly and permanently under such an obligation as this to a black person, and to this black person of all black people, this was too much. And again, that sort of thing doesn't matter, but, you know, this is talking about people during the American slave days, which doesn't excuse racism on either side, but he heaped insults upon Chambers for pretending to think he was in earnest in calling for help, and said that anybody but a block-headed Negro would have known he was funneling and left him alone. And people are so stupid now, they're removing rocks because people jokingly called rocks things, and they're like, oh no, we need to remove it, it's systemic racism, it's a boulder. Yeah, people called every other boulder things like that. No, I would have him known he was running and left him alone. Tom's enemies were in strong force here, so they came out with their opinions quite freely. They laughed at him and called him coward, liar, sneak, and other sorts of pet names, and told him they meant to call Chambers by a new name after this, and make it a common in the town. Tom Driscoll's Negropathy, to signify that he had a second birth into this life, and that Chambers was the author of his new being. Tom grew frantic under these taunts and shouted, knock their heads off, Chambers. Knock their heads off. What do you stand there for with your hands in your pockets for? Chambers expostulated and said, but Marcy Tom, dey's too many of em. Dey's, do you hear me, Tom? Please, Marcy Tom, don't make me. Dey's so many of them that. Tom sprang at him and drove his pocket knife into him 2 or 3 times before the boys could snatch him away and give him, the wounded lad, a chance to escape. What? He can't stab the enemy that has to stab the help? You know. He was considerably hurt, but not seriously. If the blade had been a little longer, his career would have ended there. Tom had long ago taught Roxy her place. It had been many a day now since she had ventured a caress or a fondling epithet in his quarter. Such things from a Negro were repulsive to him, and she had been warned to keep her distance and remember who she was. She saw her darling gradually cease from being her son. She saw that detail perish utterly. All that was left was master, pure and simple, and it was not a gentle mastership either. She saw herself sink from the sublime height of motherhood to the somber depths of unmodified slavery. The abyss of separation between her and her boy was complete. She was merely his chattel now, his convenience, his dog, his cringing and helpless slave, the humble and unresisting victim of his capricious temper and vicious nature. Sometimes he could not go to sleep, even when worn out with fatigue, because her rage boiled so high over the day's experiences with her boy. She would mumble and mutter to herself, he struck me, and I weren't no way to blame, struck me in the face right before folks, and he's always calling me Negro wench and hussy and all them mean names when I was doing the very best I can. I'm obviously changing some of the language there, but I mean, how can you say that, speak like that, and not have, I mean, this broken way, and not actually say the right words? It just doesn't make sense. Oh Lord, I done so much for him, and I lift him away to what he is, and this is what I get for it. Sometimes when some outrage of peculiar offensiveness stung her to the heart, she would plan schemes of vengeance and revel in the fancy spectacle of his exposure to the world as an impostor and a slave. But in the midst of these joys, fear would strike her. She had made him too strong. She could prove nothing, and heavens, she might get sold down the river for her pains. So her schemes always went for nothing. She laid them aside in impotent rage. Spectre slave, she might prove nothing in heaven's pains. Against the fates, and against herself for playing the fool on that fatal September day, and not providing herself with a witness for use on the day when such a thing might be needed for the appeasing of her vengeance-hungry heart. And yet, the moment Tom happened to be good to her and kind, all this occurred every now and then. All her sore places were healed, and she was happy, happy and proud. For this was her son, her Negro son, lording it among the whites and securely avenging the crimes against her race. There were 2 grand funerals in Dawson's Landing that fall, the fall of 1845. One was that of Colonel Cecil Burleigh, Essex, the other that of Percy Driscoll. On his deathbed, Driscoll set Roxy free and delivered his idolized, ostensible son solemnly into the keeping of his brother the judge and his wife. Those childless people were glad to get him. Childless people are not difficult to please. Judge Driscoll had gone privately to his brother a month before and bought chambers. He had heard that Tom had been trying to get his father to sell the boy down the river, and he wanted to prevent the scandal, for public sentiment did not approve of that way of treating family servants for light cause or for no cause. Percy Driscoll had worn himself out in trying to save his great speculative landed estate and had died without succeeding. He was hardly in his grave before the boom collapsed and left his hitherto envied young devil of an heir and pauper. But that was nothing. His uncle told him he should be his heir and have all his fortune when he died. So Tom was comforted. Roxy had no home now. So she resolved to go around and say goodbye to her friends and then clear out and see the world. That is to say, she would go chambermaiding on a steamboat, the darling ambition of her race and sex. Her last call was on the black giant, Jasper. She found him chopping Pudd'nhead Wilson's winter provision of wood. Wilson was chatting with him when Roxy arrived. He asked her how she could bear to go off chambermaiding and leave her boys, and chaffingly offered to copy off a series of their fingerprints, reaching up to their 12th year for her to remember them by. But she sobered in a moment, wondering if he suspected anything. Then she said she believed she didn't want them. Wilson said to herself, the drop of black blood in her is superstitious. She thinks there's some deviltry, some witch business about my glass mystery somewhere. She used to come here with an old horseshoe in her hand, and it could have been an accident, but I doubt it. Chapter 5. The Twins' Thrill, Dawson's Landing. I used to have a horseshoe that I hung up, and I don't think I thought it had any power. Training's everything. The peach was once a bitter almond. Cauliflower is nothing but a cabbage with a college education. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. Remember of Dr. Baldwin's concerning upstarts. We don't care to eat toadstools that think they are truffles. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. Now there's a way to find truffles out in places like this, but I don't know. I hear they go bad pretty quick too. Miss York Driscoll enjoyed 2 years of bliss with that prize. Tom, bliss that was troubled a little at times, it is true, but bliss nevertheless. Then she died, and her husband and his childless sister. Miss Pratt continued the bliss business at the old stand. Tom was petted and indulged and spoiled to his entire content, or nearly that. This went on till he was 19, and then he was sent to Yale. He went handsomely equipped with conditions, but otherwise he was not an object of distinction there. He remained at Yale 2 years and then threw up the struggle. He came home with his manners a good deal improved. He had lost his surliness and brusqueness and was rather pleasantly soft and smooth now. He was furtively and sometimes openly ironical of speech and given to gently touching people on the raw. But he did it with a good-natured, semi-conscious air that carried it off safely and kept him from getting into trouble. He was indolent as ever and showed no very strenuous desire to hunt up an occupation. People urged from this that he preferred to be supported by his uncle until his uncle's shoes should become vacant. He brought back 1 or 2 new habits with him, one which he rather openly practiced. tippling, but concealed another, which was gambling. It would not do to gamble where his uncle could hear of it. He knew that quite well. Tom's Eastern Polish was not popular among the young people. They could have endured it, perhaps, if Tom had stopped there, but he wore gloves, and that they couldn't stand and wouldn't. So he was mainly without society. He brought home with him a suit of clothes of such exquisite style and cut and fashion, Eastern fashion, city fashion, that it filled everybody with anguish and was regarded as a peculiarly wanton front. He enjoyed the feeling, which he was exciting, and paraded the town serene and happy all day. But the young fellows set a tailor to work that night, and when Tom started out on his parade next morning, he found the old deformed Negro bell-ringer straddling along in his wake, tricked out in a flamboyant curtain calico exaggeration of his finery, and imitating his fancy Eastern graces as well as he could. Tom surrendered, and after that clothed himself in the local fashion. But the dull country town was tiresome to him since his acquaintanceship with livelier regions, and it grew daily more and more so. He began to make little trips to St. Louis for refreshment. Aren't you supposed to say St. Louis? Or, yeah. Well, in America, we would say Louis, but there he found companionship to suit him and pleasures to his taste, along with more freedom in some particulars than he could have at home. So during the next 2 years of his visits to the city grew in frequency, and his tarryings there grew steadily longer in duration. He was getting into deep waters. He was taking chances privately, which might get him into trouble someday. In fact, did. Judge Driscoll had retired from the bench and from all business activities in 1850, and had now been comfortably idle 3 years. He was president of the Free Thinkers Society, and Pudd'nhead Wilson was the other member. The society's weekly discussions were now the old lawyer's main interest in life. Pudd'nhead was still toiling in obscurity at the bottom of the ladder, under the blight of that unlucky remark which he had left fall 23 years before about the dog. Judge Driscoll was his friend, and claimed that he had a mind above the average, but that was regarded as one of the judge's whims, and it failed to modify the public opinion, or rather that was one of the reasons why it failed. But there was another and better one. If the judge had stopped with bare assertion, it would have a good deal of effect, but he made the mistake of trying to prove his position. For some years Wilson had been privately at work on a whimsical almanac for his amusement, a calendar with little dab of ostensible philosophy, usually in ironical form, appended to each date, and the judge thought these quips and fancies of Wilson's were neatly turned and cute, so he carried a handful of them around one day and read them to some of the chief citizens. But irony was not for those people. Their mental vision was not focused for it. They read those playful trifles in the solid earnest, and decided without hesitancy that if there had been ever any doubt that David Wilson was a Pudd'nhead, which there hadn't, this revelation had removed that doubt for good and all. That is just the way in this world. An enemy can partly ruin a man, but it takes a good-natured and judicious friend to complete the thing and make it perfect. After this, the judge felt tenderer than ever towards Wilson, and surer than ever that his calendar had merit. Judge Driscoll could be a freethinker and still hold his place in society because he was the person of most consequence in the community, and therefore could venture to go his own way and follow out his own notions. The other member of his pet organization was allowed the like liberty because he was a cipher in the estimation of the public, and nobody attached any importance to what he thought or did. He was liked and was welcomed enough all around, but he simply didn't count for anything. The widow Cooper, affectionately called Aunt Patsy by everybody, lived in a snug and comely cottage with her daughter Rowena, who was 19, romantic, amiable, and very pretty, but otherwise of no consequence Rowena had a couple of young brothers, also of no consequence. The widow had a large spare room which she let to a lodger with a board when she could find one, but this room had been empty for a year now. To her sorrow, her income was only sufficient for the family support, and she needed the lodging money for trifling luxuries. But now, at last, on a flaming June day, she found herself happy. Her tedious wait was ended. Her year-worn advertisement had been answered, and not by a village applicant. Oh no, this letter was from away off yonder in the dim, great world to the north. It was from St. Louis. She sat on her porch, gazing out with unseeing eyes upon the shining reaches of the mighty Mississippi, her thoughts steeped in her good fortune. Indeed, it was especially good fortune, for she was to have 2 lodgers instead of 1. She had read the letter to the family, and Rowena had danced away to see the cleaning and the airing of the room by the slave woman Nancy, and to the boys had rushed abroad in the town to spread the great news, for it was a matter of public interest, and the public would wonder and not be pleased if not informed. Presently Rowena returned, all ablush with joyous excitement, and begged for a rereading of the letter. It was framed thus: "Honored Madam, my brother and I have seen your advertisement by chance, and beg to leave to take the room you offer. We are 24 years of age and twins. We are Italians by birth, but have lived long in various countries of Europe and several years in the United States. Our names are Luigi and Angelo Capello. You desire but 1 guest, but, dear madame, if you will allow us to pay for 2, we will not incommodate you. We shall be down Thursday. Italians, how romantic! Just think, Ma, there's never been one in this town, and everybody will be dying to see them, and they're all ours. Think of that. Yes, I reckon they'll make a grand stir. Oh, indeed they will. The whole town will be on its head. Think, they've been in Europe and everywhere. There's never been a traveler in this town before. Ma, I shouldn't wonder if they've seen kings. Well, a body can't tell, but they'll make stir enough without that. Yes, that's of course. Luigi, Angelo. They're lovely names, and so grand and foreign, not like Jones and Robinson and such. Thursday they are coming, and this is only Tuesday. It's a cruel, long time to wait. Here comes Judge Driscoll in at the gate. He's heard about it. I'll go up and open the door. Judge was full of congratulations and curiosity. The letter was read and discussed. Soon Justice Robinson arrived with more congratulations, and there was a reading and a new discussion. This was after the beginning. Neighbor after neighbor of both sexes followed. Okay, well, this is in the bit. And, well, sometimes you find that what's foreign is not exactly the interesting thing one wants, right? But we're made different races and tribes and colors and genders and all sorts of stuff, to make things interesting, right? And I honestly don't know what animal was moving about that there. I don't think it was a squirrel. Are the turtles out?